morning, church. I'm Anna Pharaoh, and I'm delighted to be introducing a new series to you today. It's about one of the most exciting Old Testament heroes, a real Sunday school favourite. It is the book of Daniel. Our preaching series will be focusing on the first half of the book, which describe the events of Daniel's life, as opposed to the last half, which is the visions that he had. But before we go any further, I'd like to pray. Gracious Father, give us diligence to seek you and wisdom to find you today. May our ears hear your voice, our eyes see your goodness, and our tongues proclaim your name as we commit our lives to pleasing you. Amen. So if I were to ask you to call out some headline events of the book of Daniel, I'm sure most of you wouldn't have much trouble conjuring up one or two memories of dramatic things that happen in this book. I'm thinking lion's den, raging furnace, towering statue, writing on the wall, for a start. It's a great book, and there's actually loads in the first chapter even before we get to any of those things. And that's what we're looking at today, the first chapter. I've divided it into 5 sections, which will be the main points of my talk. And they are the context, the characters, the challenge, the crunch, and the consequences. We're going to listen first of all to a dramatic reading of the chapter. It's called The Bible Experience, and I hope you enjoy it. We will listen to it and then we'll go through it together in more detail.
The Book of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel,
I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you.
Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah,
Please, test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see.
So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
So let's get started. The context, first of all. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year that Jehoiakim was king of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia attacked Jerusalem and surrounded the city. The Lord let him capture King Jehoiakim and seize some of the temple treasures. He took some prisoners back with him to the temple of his gods in Babylon and put the captured treasures in the temple storerooms. So what we're reading about here is an invasion, isn't it? It's a city being besieged by its enemy, which commentators tell us was the superpower of its day. That's Babylonia. And the city it overthrew was Jerusalem. We only have 2 verses describing this, and I find that fascinating because I think it could take up an entire film. It's very dramatic, it's terrifying, but it's clearly not the main focus of the writer of Daniel, is it? His main purpose seems to be to lay out this life, Daniel's life, before us, that we might take notice of the choices he made and what happened as a result. So the invasion and subsequent exile, while pretty fascinating in themselves, are just the context. We're going to read verses 3 to 6 next, which introduces us to the characters. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief official, to select from among the Israelite exiles some young men of the royal family and of the noble families. They had to be handsome, intelligent, well-trained, quick to learn, and free from physical defects, so that they would be qualified to serve in the royal court. Ashpenaz was to teach them to read and write the Babylonian language. The king also gave orders that every day they were to be given the same food and wine as the members of the royal court. After 3 years of this training, they were to appear before the king. Among those chosen were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all of whom were from the tribe of Judah. So we have this captured group of Israelites, and we're zooming in now to get to the few that this book is really about. The passage tells us 8 things about them. They were young men, royalty or nobility, handsome, intelligent, well-trained, quick to learn, and free from physical defect. Now, I imagined I'd asked all of you to stand up before I read out that list and said that I wanted you to sit down when there was something that ruled you out. Young is the first. Well, we have a fair few of those in church. But obviously men, that would be, I'm guessing, around half. Point number 3 though, royalty and nobility, I'm pretty sure we'd all be out of the running at that point, which is good probably, because if we'd have got as far as the 4th requirement, handsomeness, that could have been awkward. The point I'm trying to make is that the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, had steep requirements for these positions in his court. I mean, even if you'd passed all the first 7, the 8th was to have no physical defects. I mean, who is like that? Well, we're about to meet 4 of the very few people on earth, I think, who did qualify on every single one of those points. Their names, as we've said, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They were young men whose entire lives and life expectations had just been forcibly turned upside down inside out and shaken hard. Young men who'd just been through so much, it's very difficult to imagine. And hard even to define what that made them now. Refugees? Not quite. Prisoners, yes, but with royal benefits. It's a fascinating scenario. So we come to verse 4 now. We've obviously just read it, but I'm zooming in on that again because that is the challenge, my third point. We learn that these Jewish exiles were to be trained for 3 years in Babylonian language and culture in preparation for serving in the royal court. Now this might not sound all that bad to our ears. 3 years of training, that's basically a degree, a free degree, and with a very strong chance of a job at the end. I think that's pretty amazing. But of course, this wasn't a job in their own country or their own language or culture, and it wasn't a job they'd volunteered for. This group of young guys was forced into this situation. It wasn't a benevolent act. It wasn't intended for their benefit. The IVP New Bible Commentary calls it a religious reprogramming, and it says, their language, literature and diet all carried religious as well as cultural meanings. Then the commentators more ominously call it a brain drain, which would simultaneously weaken the prospect of a capable future leadership in Israel and strengthen Babylonian society. I'll just read that again. A brain drain which would simultaneously weaken the prospect of a capable future leadership in Israel and strengthen Babylonian society. In other words, your enemy attacks and carries off your most precious artifacts, as well as your country's brightest and most promising future leaders, leaving you bereft, not only for now, but for the future. Goodness. And yet, despite how bleak this situation seemed, this is a story about the living God. So we can know with certainty that all was not lost for Jerusalem and for Daniel and his peers. I wonder how our faith would have held up, though, in the face of this kind of attack. Maybe your faith is facing a full-on attack. Maybe not obviously, but inwardly. How do you get through it? This is, I believe, the reason Daniel is in the Bible, to prompt us to consider this question and grapple with it. How do we survive attacks on us and our faith? As we look at verse 6 and consider the meaning of these young men's names, I think we start to get some clues about what prepared them for the trials which lay ahead and how they survived. Verse 6 shows us the significance of their names. They are called Daniel, which means God is my judge. Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. And lastly, Azariah means Yahweh has helped. What amazing names. What armour to go into life with. Imagine if we all fully understood those 4 things about God: that he is our judge, that he has been gracious, who is what God is, and that he has helped. But of course, it may not have felt or seemed as if Daniel's God was being all those things at the time. The judge, i.e. in complete authority, gracious, incomparable, the helper of all who believe. I'm sure that even the most mature among us feel that sometimes. Let's go back to verse 7, because it tells us that these names, these strong, distinctive Hebrew names, were changed in Babylon. Verse 7 says, the chief official gave them new names: Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Just like that. It's a very dehumanising act, I think, to forcibly change someone's name, throwing away what was their identity and branding them with something completely foreign to their ears. these Jewish names were precious and significant to these four. The African Bible commentary says, to Semitic people, that is, people connected with ancient language such as Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and others, names are not merely labels. Just as African names connect Africans with their ancestors, their tribal values, their collective destiny, so do those of Hebrews. So the changing of their names was intended to disconnect them from their ancestors, their covenant relationship with Jehovah, and their collective destiny as a people. They were now called Belteshazzar, meaning favoured by Bel, the patron god of Babylon. Shadrach, which seems to be a reference to the Babylonian sun god. Meshach means belonging to Shak, the wine goddess. And Abednego means servant of the shining fire, which one source I looked at said was equivalent to Lucifer. The African Bible commentary goes on to say Daniel and his friends had no choice about their names. However, where they had a choice and where it mattered most, they chose for Jehovah. I love that. So what we come to next is the crunch, our fourth point, and probably the longest. It is in verse 8, and it's where Daniel takes his first stand. Verse 8 in the Good News Bible says, Daniel made up his mind not to let himself become ritually unclean by eating the royal food and drinking the wine of the royal court. Most versions say not to defile himself. Young's literal translation says, Daniel purposeth in his heart that he will not pollute himself with the king's portion of food and wine. Now, remember what's happened to Daniel and his friends up to this point. They'd been kidnapped, taken to a foreign land, told they'd be held there and reprogrammed as Babylonians. In all likelihood had their appearance and clothing changed and had their names ripped away, with really not much comment from the writer of Daniel. Had the four of them gone along with everything willingly? We don't know. But what we do know is that this is the crunch point. It is at this point, when they're offered the royal food, that Daniel says, do you know what? No further. This is my line in the sand. So why do we think Daniel takes his stand over this issue in particular, and at this point in the book? Well, Bible scholars believe it could have been for more than one reason. The word unclean makes it sound as if it was Jewish laws that would have prevented Daniel and his friends from eating the food. Maybe if it included pork and other Jewish no-nos. Or perhaps that food had been offered to idols and was therefore unclean according to the rules of the Old Testament. But if that was the case, why did Daniel agree to eat the vegetables, which might have been offered to idols too? It may have been that this was Daniel's first opportunity to resist the assimilation taking place. What you eat is your choice at the end of the day. Or as Ernest C. Lucas says in the Apollos commentary on Daniel, to accept and eat such food was apparently to commit oneself to loyal allegiance to the king. So it could have been any and all of these things. Allegiance is a big theme of Daniel. I wonder where our allegiance lays. Not only does Daniel take his stand, he first raises it with Ashpenaz, the head of the palace staff, and then with the guard that Ashpenaz had put in charge of him. Maybe he could have done it without making an obvious stand, just kind of saying he wasn't hungry or pushing it on someone else's plate. But he doesn't. He makes a point and is clear and above board in what he's doing. And I think this is a great example to us. An American preacher called Paul Laboutier, who I found on YouTube, says this: Daniel and his friends, had they decided to just go ahead and eat it, had they said to themselves, we're going to be here a long time, we can't just keep putting up a fight, we might as well just eat the stupid food and call it good. Had they done this, they would have compromised their consciences, and compromising our consciences can bring extenuating circumstances to our walk with Jesus. I thought that was a very challenging point. So I'm going to pause here and ask, what is this bringing up for us? What has been our crossroads moment individually? How did we handle it? Because if you haven't had a crossroads moment yet, a point in your life where you have to choose between what you're being asked to do and what your conscience tells you to do, you will have sooner or later. It might not be like Daniel's crossroads moment. It might be a decision more privately taken. But the challenge of this book is that when it comes to the moment, what are you going to do? I feel I have to warn you that if and when you do follow your God-given conscience, it might not work out quite as well on earth as it does for Daniel. We haven't come to that just yet, but spoiler alert, it works out great for him. If only all of our crossroads decisions, the ones we've had palpitations over, the ones we've lost sleep over, if only all of them landed us with promotion and kingly praise. I'm sorry to say, not all of them will. Some who have taken a stand for Christ find themselves very quickly at the end of their earthly road as a result. Not always, but some. And anyway, if we're worried that our stand for Jesus may mean losing out on promotion and kingly praise, we've kind of missed the point. The book of 1 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 18 and 19 says, I give you this instruction in keeping with the prophecies once made about you, so that by following them you may fight the good fight, holding on to faith and a good conscience. Some have rejected these and so have shipwrecked their faith. So the book of Daniel seems to be saying to us, this is how you do it. This is how you survive life's challenges with your faith intact. Fight the good fight, hold on to faith, follow your conscience. Stand out, be set apart. This is your calling in Christ. As I've mentioned already, Daniel does take his stand. He and his friends refuse the king's food and wine for 10 days, sticking just to vegetables and water, and it goes very well for them. And this is my fifth and last point, the consequence. Verse 15 and 16 says, when the time was up, they looked healthier and stronger than those who'd been eating the royal food. So from then on, the guard let them continue. It's interesting, isn't it? Do we think the Bible is kind of making an advert for the vegan lifestyle here? I'm not convinced that it is. Even vegans don't just eat vegetables. There's more to a balanced diet than that. No, the text shows us that actually it's working out for Daniel because the hand of God is on him. There have been repeated references to the hand of God thus far if we've been alert to them. Verse 2 says, the Lord let him capture the city. Verse 9, God made Ashpenaz sympathetic to Daniel. Verse 17, to come, God gave the 4 young men knowledge and skill in literature and philosophy. So God's hand, his providence, is on Daniel all the way through this. And I think it's worth making that link between Daniel having made his stand and God's blessing pouring out on him. Might sound obvious to you, but I think that's worth emphasising. The preacher I mentioned earlier from Calvary Chapel, Oregon, Paul Laboutier, has this to say about what being set apart does for our spiritual life. He says, understand the exhortation of the word about coming out from the world and being separate. People who walk in obedience with the Lord grow, but people who play games with God stay infants in Christ. Again, that feels like a sermon I'd like to hear. But even though we haven't got time to look at just that right now, we can be assured there are countless scriptures which back this up. For example, in Psalm 62, the psalmist says, "I depend on God alone. I put my hope in him. He alone protects and saves me. He is my defender, and I shall never be defeated. You yourself, O Lord, reward everyone according to their deeds." John 14:21 says, and this is Jesus, "Whoever accepts my commandments and obeys them is the one who loves me. My Father will love whoever loves me." There's a connection between obedience and growth, isn't there? And although we don't want to fall into the trap of saying our success depends on us, because it doesn't, it's God's grace. At the same time, if you think of a good parent teaching their child a new skill, the child only learns if they follow instructions, if they obey. The child who refuses to learn and who won't try, that child's still loved completely. But they're not experiencing the joy of learning that new skill, of developing, of thriving. It's the same with us and the godly principles that the Bible teaches. God still loves the disobedient and the one who doesn't try, but that person won't grow. So we're just going to read this last section now, and we're on the last bit. 17 to 21. God gave the 4 young men knowledge and skill in literature and philosophy. In addition, he gave Daniel skill in interpreting visions and dreams. At the end of the 3 years set by the king, Ashpenaz took all the young men to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them all, and Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah impressed him more than any of the others. So they became members of the king's court. No matter what question the king asked, or what problem he raised, these 4 knew 10 times more than any fortune teller or magician in his whole kingdom. Daniel remained at the court until Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, conquered Babylonia. So they complete their degrees. They get to finally meet the Babylonian king, and he is vastly impressed with these 4 men. Above all others, they get the promised jobs at court. The text said no matter what question the king asked or what problem he raised, these 4 knew 10 times more than any fortune teller in the whole kingdom. Not twice as much, I'd be content with twice. No, 10 times. God makes them 10 times as impressive as all those around them. Maybe God was thinking, Babylon, you wanted the cream of the crop. You've got the cream of the crop, 10 times better than you even thought they could be. But if you think you can bend them to your will alone, you've got another thing coming. And that is what you can look forward to hearing more about in the coming weeks. Thank you.